Howdy, Full Metal Cowboy, straight shooting a review of Back to the Future Part 2. As you can see, I'm sitting in the driver's seat. My previous review of Back to the Future had me in the driver's seat at night. I don't have a driver's license, therefore I can't drive this vehicle. I'm only sitting in a driver's seat for this review for consistency's sake with my previous Back to the Future review, because Back to the Future involved a car that can go 88 miles per hour, which would involve time travel because that's how Back to the Future was written. So for that visual nod, that's why my review is like this. Like many, I am extremely fond of the original Back to the Future film. It is the best film in the trilogy. And I remembered first seeing it back in high school because I had a teacher that just loved Back to the Future that much that he wanted to show his students Back to the Future. And that's how I finally saw it. Now, when it comes to the sequels, Part 2 and Part 3, I actually didn't watch those alongside the first back in high school. And I finally saw Part 2 and 3 back about a year ago. And you know what? I don't think they're as great as the first Back to the Future film, which I think is a given because many people agree that Parts 2 and 3 just aren't on par with the original because the first Back to the Future film is so damn good. Even if that is the case, that shouldn't shy anyone away from watching Back to the Future Part 2 and Back to the Future Part 3. And that's because Back to the Future Part 2 is actually quite interesting because Doc Brown and Marty McFly go to the future of 2015. Now keep in mind, Back to the Future Part 2 is a work of fiction. Not everything that 2015 was predicted in Back to the Future was correct. But there are some occurrences that almost came true, with one being a parallel. One of them being the Cubs winning the World Series. According to Back to the Future Part 2, it happened in 2015, but they were 1 year late. They won the World Series in 2016. Now there's Biff in the future who has a striking parallel to Donald Trump. Great Scott, this is heavy! Actual events has actually made Back to the Future Part 2 age well! Now, the one thing that hasn't aged well is some of the visual effects, but it's only a few scenes where it really sticks out like a sore thumb. As for the visual effects themselves, they're just as good as the first Back to the Future film. Alan Silvestri, who composed the film score for the first Back to the Future film, returns to do the film score for Back to the Future Part 2. And there is a bit of a difference comparing the two films. The first one was prominent for having Huey Lewis in the news with the song Power of Love, which, let's face it, Back to the Future is not without that song. Back to the Future Part 2 is pretty much an orchestral soundtrack, which I think is a nice bit of change of scenery in terms of music for Alan Silvestri's score. Now, even though Back to the Future Part 2 has a future timeline presented in the Back to the Future trilogy, it also retreads the first Back to the Future film in certain events, but in a different point of view. While this is inventive, I do find this to be the weakest part about Back to the Future Part 2, because we have seen these events done before, sure from a different point of view in Back to the Future Part 2, but why rewatch the same events that we've seen before? Now, if Back to the Future Part 2 just sticks to present-time characters meeting future-time characters, and that would be just it, I would have been content with Back to the Future Part 2 as a great sequel. But retreading the first Back to the Future film, I just never understood what the point of it was. Back to the Future Part 3 doesn't do this. It's only Back to the Future Part 2. And it's really not a big deal when it comes to Part 2 because it doesn't play a huge part in Back to the Future Part 2. They do focus more on the future, which is great, but I just felt this one particular plot point just didn't really mesh well given what has happened with the rest of the film before and since. Now, while the original Back to the Future leaves open for a sequel, Back to the Future Part 2 ends in a cliffhanger. Dun dun dun! To be continued! Great Scott! Now, Back to the Future Part 2 has a bit of an oddity when it comes to films. It ends with a trailer for Back to the Future Part 3. I find this pretty redundant now with Back to the Future Part 3 already being released, but back then, yeah, it was in there because they wanted to assure that there's a Part 3 already coming on the way. Most recent example I can think of is The Avengers. After Captain America, the first Avenger, ended, there was a trailer showing The Avengers, May 2012. Yeah, that's what happened. Strange and kind of redundant now, but hey, you know what? At the time, they had to assure people this is happening. They need to stop doing this within films because it just doesn't make any sense. There's the internet, for crying out loud, now. We know when these films are coming out. Back to the Future Part 2 is a good sequel. It's not on par with the original, but a lot of people know it's not as good as the original. The original is the best. I do find Part 2 to be the weakest of the three, but the Back to the Future trilogy is a good set of films. You can't really go wrong with any of the Back to the Future films. They are consistently good, even with some hiccups here and there with the sequels. With that said, I'm going to go 88 miles per hour for a 9 out of 10 for Back to the Future Part 2. Stay tuned for my review of Back to the Future Part 3. I might as well get that review out as soon as possible. So until then, I will be reloading for my next review. So until then, I will see you later.